Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast. It's just the beginning of January 2020, and today we're going to be talking to Deepak Jayaraman, who helps people play to their unique potential. Deepak, welcome. I'm going to take just a moment to introduce you, and then I'm quite sure that our conversation is going to reveal the many facets of your interests and activities and the wonderful work you do. So you're currently working as a career advisor, helping people to learn how to grow and where to go. You're a prolific podcaster, way ahead of us on that curve, and we have a lot to learn from you. And you do all kinds of interesting volunteer work, also helping people to grow. And we'll be looking forward to talking to you about all these aspects in today's podcast. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your time so generously.
Thank you, Claire, for having me.
So it's a real pleasure to have you here. Tell us a little about where we're speaking to you and just give us a picture of what you've been doing today.
Sure. I'm here in my offices in Mumbai, in India, Western India, and this is the winter season in India, which means the temperature is around the temperatures that you would see around the summer in the UK. So it's around a nice, pleasant 18, 20 degrees in Mumbai.
Fantastic.
So yeah, the day started with a good run around about 6-7K run. We have a half marathon coming up this Sunday in Mumbai. It's a big event, so I'm sort of training for it. So it was a nice relaxed run, warming up for it. And it's been a couple of client meetings and a few calls. So it's been a good day so far.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's start with a question about the big transition that you have made in recent years, but I'm really interested into the path you've taken. You started off as a consultant in very well-known companies. You were at McKinsey and then made the switch to headhunting at Egon Zehnder, where our paths didn't cross time-wise, but they could have. And more recently, you decided to leave that world and become a coach and get involved in the different activities we've already mentioned. How do you describe the reasons for those transitions and what have you learned from them?
I think the context to these transitions was slightly different. Maybe let me start with the first one, which was the transition from McKinsey to Egon Zehnder. Actually, the trigger for that was a personal situation. This is, I think, about a decade back, March 2008. I was with McKinsey in the New Jersey office, largely doing healthcare work. And my wife was working as a social impact professional in New York. And I discovered that my father, who was living in Chennai, was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And it's one of those things where I took a plane and came down immediately to find out what was going on. And the doctor said, given the gravity of the situation, it's hard for us to predict. Would it be 2 weeks? Would it be 1 year? Would it be 6 months? So I think he would need your sort of attention and sort of in a way. Sometimes I realize when things aren't grave, then it's in the realm of discussion. But this felt like a no debate. My wife and I immediately packed our bags, came back, and she was quite supportive. I'm very thankful to her for supporting this move. So we moved back to India with McKinsey, and McKinsey people talk about being a empathetic meritocracy. A lot of people see the meritocracy part. I think that's the phase when I saw the empathy part. They were open enough to accommodate me back in Chennai. That's around the time they opened the third office in India. Till then, they had offices only in Bombay and Delhi. And I worked on a few non-client projects. So long story short, I think that phase of life gave me a little bit of a window into, what matters in life, given what I saw my father go through towards the end of his life. And second is it also gave me a little bit of mind space to reflect on what gave me energy. And somewhere I felt the people side of things gave me energy. The managing director, Ian Davis, at that time would talk about IQ, CQ, RQ as the 3 domains or 3 vectors along which he would look at consultants. McKinsey would look at consultants, IQ being intellect, CQ being the capability quotient or the toolkit of the consultant, and RQ being the relationship quotient. And RQ was turning out to be my spike. And And that's around the time one of the senior directors at McKinsey in Chennai, a gentleman I have a lot of gratitude for, Ramesh Mangaleshwaran, I'll take his name. He said, "You seem to have that people orientation. Have you thought about search? Why don't I introduce you to this partner at Egon Zehnder, a gentleman called Govind, who's another friend and a mentor." And one thing led to another. To be candid, it wasn't a well-considered move to say, search is the right option, but actually it took somebody else to see me, to sort of see where I had potential, if I may use the term, and sort of map me in a different canvas, make that introduction, and then open that world for me. So in a way, that was sort of the crux of how that transition played out. It was a combination of me coming to a certain sense of clarity around what gave me energy, coupled with an individual who connected the dots and made that canvas possible for me. That's sort of the way I would see it.
May I just interrupt? I remember
Please.
in some of your writing, or perhaps one of your videos, you talk very specifically about having got this realization that RQ was your thing, your spike, as you say. And you talk specifically about having leaned into that particular realization. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that process. Leaning in is a trendy phrase. We're not going to go back into who first coined it, but tell us about how that really played out for you.
It's a good question, Claire. And I must say, some of this is also with the wisdom of hindsight and sort of connecting the dots when you look back. But maybe going back to that phase in life, if I looked at the various pathways I was considering, a lot of the pathways were very traditional post-McKinsey type pathways. For example, private equity, venture capital, strategic planning roles in large companies, and so on. And then there was executive search. So at that time, if I had sort of gone with the conventional wisdom, I would have possibly picked what most people would have thought appropriate for me to have done, which is, I come from a reasonably, quant background, given my engineering degree. So that sort of lends itself nicely to a private equity kind of a context, which is also financially quite rewarding. Yes. So at that time, I remember thinking about what I read when I open the newspaper. One of my mentors once told me that if you want to consider a career in investing, the first thing you should look at the paper when you open it is the market indices. And if you don't do it, then don't consider a career in investing. And somehow that phrase stuck with me. So I think to your point, I think it was at that phase where I said, let me sort of lean into, and when I looked at the various options on the table, Egon Zehnder was the one which seemed to play in the direction of where I got my energy, right, off the various choices at that point in time. So that's what I mean by leaning into that sort of spike, if you will.
Okay. So you went into Egon Zehnder. You probably had as many interviews as I did when I joined the firm. Quite extraordinary. We can talk more about that offline. But tell me then how you managed that transition. It's a big jump. However logical it seems to go from a McKinsey to a Zehnder. Tell us a little bit about that, and then also tell us about how you came out.
No, I think I'm very grateful for my time at Egon Zehnder because really built a very special set of friendships, relationships, but also it was a phase where I would think I'd like to believe that my learning curve was the steepest, both in terms of understanding of the world around business and leadership, but also in terms of self-awareness. So I look back at the 6 years at Egon Zehnder with a lot of fondness. Back to your question about the transition to Egon Zehnder, I would say the one word that comes to mind is apprenticeship. I was living in Chennai. I moved to Bombay because the managing partner at that time was a gentleman called Govind, who's a mentor and a friend. And I would say him and another colleague, again, since I have a lot of gratitude for these people, I want to sort of take the liberty of taking the names. A gentleman called Neeraj Sagar. They both, he was sort of the industrials practice head where I did a lot of work. So these two individuals I would call out for spending a lot of time with me. And it's a profession where, the what of the profession is pretty straightforward, but it's the how which builds the premium, as you would appreciate. Absolutely. So they would spend time with me, coaching me on the various conversations, give me feedback. sit in on meetings initially, handhold me. So I would think, search is also a black box kind of a profession, right? You don't really know what it is till you get into it. At that point of time, my logic for joining Agon Zender was, here are a bunch of people I like. They seem to be smart and they could have done anything else, but they seem to have chosen to do search. So if they like it, I ought to like it, right? That sort of was the sort of indirect way of convincing myself that it was the right thing for me. But to your question, I think the transition was enabled by apprenticeship, especially from these two individuals who really took a lot of time to guide me through the various nuances of search. And moving on to the other question about transitioning out of search, I think around the 3-year mark, when I became principal, which was on track to partner, and I think it was one of the subsequent performance conversations with the office manager, and I remember him asking me what were the high points of last year, personally. And a good search consultant having fun would typically say when I won this search or when I placed the CEO or, some such thing. And I remember telling the partner that, my high point was when I had this conversation with this candidate, and that candidate later sent me an email saying that chat changed my life. And I remember the leader saying, that's fantastic, but that's not necessarily good for business. When I say good for business, not sufficient for business. It's a good hygiene to have, but there are other pillars for you to focus on. And that's when as I started reflecting on it, I realized that I was enjoying the candidate conversations more than the client conversations. And I felt, that was giving me more energy. And I think sometimes when people frame it in a pithy phrase, it sticks with you. One of my friends, I remember him telling me, you have more of a coaching mindset than a poaching mindset.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful phrase. Yeah.
And I think that was sort of a penny drop moment to say, maybe because the search, I have a lot of respect for the profession and for Agon Zender, because hiring well is an art, as you would appreciate as a prior search consultant. But and could I do that as a job? Yes. But was I getting energy from it? And was I being distinctive at it? ? So I said, why don't I once again lean into having more helping conversations and fewer judging conversations, and see if I can sort of build something there. So in a way, that was sort of the crux of the idea that eventually decided, that led me to moving on from Agon Zender. I mean, the other personal context is I have 2 children, a 10-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son. I think about 4 or 5 years back, my son had just been born. And I think that I think was another factor where I said, maybe I should also take charge of the pace at which I ran my life. And when you're working with any, whether it's a professional services firm or a venture-funded startup, somebody else is setting the pace of your treadmill. Absolutely. So I said, why don't I choose a life where I get the remote control on the treadmill and see how fast I want to run at a certain point in time. So in a way, that's sort of the crux of the transition from Agon Zender to what I do now.
Absolutely. So taking control, setting your own rhythms, your own ambitions. Tell me a little bit about how you went about setting up your own business and how that felt compared to the structured, rhythmed corporate life that you'd had up till then, and what the big challenges were, and the pleasures for that matter.
Sure. So I would say, I mean, a little bit of demographic context. I come from a certain community in South India, which is known for extreme risk aversion, right? It's informally called the Tam-Rams, which is a certain subset of community which has produced a lot of thinkers. There's a certain orientation towards knowledge, but not necessarily known for commerce. There are certain pockets of India which are known for commercial acumen. So that's not something. So the reason I mention is, if you'd asked me 10 years back, would I have put money on myself as potentially being an entrepreneur or a solopreneur? I would not have, because I don't think I felt I had that capability. But I think this is where, once again, I have a ex-colleague of mine, a lady called Mrinalini, who's now back a partner at McKinsey. She was my colleague at Agon Zender and my neighbor and a good friend. And I remember we were having one of the conversations about business development, right? And one of the things she said, which stuck with me, was she said, maybe the business development, the way it's done in search, is not up your alley. But if you're really passionate about something, you will be able to authentically develop your own business in line with your strengths. And somehow that stuck with me. Back to your question about first few, the sort of the starting phase, I must say, initially I thought I would name my practice as Leadership Insight. I felt I wanted to create, the grand vision at that stage was I had this passion for content creation, video creation, content creation. A little bit of trivia: when I was living in London back in 2000, maybe a short story. I was at Covent Garden looking at a juggling performance. And I remember walking up to the juggler there saying, I want to learn juggling. So he said, come to my shop in Camden Town. Camden Town, as is a sort of an interesting part of town where the average piercings per body or tattoos per body is like 5 per capita, right?
Absolutely.
So I would show up every weekend, Camden Town, learn juggling. And I sort of got reasonably good at 3-ball juggling and 4-ball juggling over time, over a couple of years. And then at some stage, I wanted to create a video saying, I want to teach kids juggling now that I know this. At that time, we didn't have YouTube. So I remember sort of cutting a video CD, and I would distribute to kids on how to juggle, juggling 101. So I think there was a part of me which said, maybe I like creating content. Even when I read books that leave a mark on me, I try and create a synthesis, right? Mindset by Carol Dweck. I distill it into 10 pages. So it's sort of something that I do anyway for myself. So I said, and when I looked around, I said, there's a lot of content, but there's no curated content. So I thought I'll do a video series and so on. But quickly I spoke to people and they said, this whole world of content is going through an explosion. Don't even go there. If you want to create content as a business, forget about it. But if you want to create content as something that enables your primary strength, which is your consulting and your coaching, maybe that's a good idea. So that was sort of, let's say, feedback number one. I spoke to a bunch of people in the content space. So I said, okay, let's not lose sight. And second is, as I thought about the niche, I realized that I need to pick a niche where I become the go-to person over time. And I felt leadership was too vast a canvas. And I asked myself, what's the niche where I've built career capital? And somewhere I felt transitions, I could relate to, because I had a window seat to transitions when I was at Egon Zehnder, hundreds and thousands of them. Every candidate conversation is a transition conversation. Every candidate you face is a transition. So I said, why don't I? And when I looked at individuals, I felt they were navigating the transition in a reasonably lonely manner. Whether it's a candidate going through a what next conversation, or a leader who's just been placed, who's thinking through a how do I settle conversation, or a leader who's been promoted, who's saying, how do I scale up conversation. So I felt, why don't I pick transitions as a space where I hopefully build capability, build on the career capital I have, and build credibility over time. And I said, that's sort of at least discovery number 2 that happened along the way early on. And the podcast, I said, let me sort of leverage it it does 2 functions for me, right? One is L&D. It's an opportunity for me to learn and grow. And second is it's the marketing function. And I said, the other advice I got was, if you don't belong to a platform, you disappear, right? Because people, in this world of infinite choices, people will forget you quickly. So I said, I need to put something out there consistently for letting people know that I exist. So in a way, that's sort of the genesis of the podcast, Play to Potential podcast. So I kept it as audio because I wanted to keep the cost low, but the production value high. So I said, audio gives me the intimacy without the cost. So those were the set of early choices, if you will, in the context of setting my practice. But your question, it was lonely. Initially, of course, there were a few early relationships from Egon Zehnder, and they were willing to, they were kind enough to trust me with their business. And that took off. But I must say, initially there was a little bit of where will the pipeline come from, and those moments, and that's where I'm grateful for my spouse, because when you're in a company, you have people around you to guide you and to help you. But when you're on your own, especially as call it gig economy, call it solopreneurship, whatever the term, or independent producer, as Linda Grattan calls it, I feel the role of the spouse is significant in ensuring that the spouse gives you the support on the bad days. So that's been helpful. But I think from then on, touch wood, it's been a virtuous cycle, and so far so good.
Can you give us any insight into how you've built your podcast following? Maybe give us some numbers if you can, but some insight into how one can create a successful podcast series.
Sure. Successful question mark. I'm not sure. I'm there yet. But see, I think it genuinely comes from a place of curiosity and passion. And if I may talk about where the motivation comes from, again, it's a book from a different domain. I was deeply inspired by the book Curious Mind by this Hollywood producer, Brian Grazer, who's been the producer of the movie Beautiful Mind about John Nash, if you saw it.
Yes.
Or Apollo 13. And the crux of the book, he says is every couple of weeks he has a conversation with somebody outside in a different field, right? A biologist, an army officer, a scientist, and so on. And he says, over time, the dots connect and patterns form. And that's how, and he says curiosity is good from multiple perspectives, from a influencing perspective, business development perspective, relationships perspective, and so on. So I said, going back to the why of the podcast, and maybe relating to another example from my personal experience of living in London, I used to go to Hyde Park Corner every now and then. There's speakers corner there.
Oh, yes.
And I realized that if there are 4 or 5 speakers, there's an opportunity for some crowd to gather around these speakers. But if I realized that if there were 1,000 speakers in the same speaker's corner, it would be cacophony. So I said, instead of creation, let me do curation. So that was sort of the genesis of the podcast. So a lot of people said, why don't you become a speaker? And I felt, it felt inauthentic because, there's only so much finite stuff that I know. But I said, let me be a seeker instead of a speaker. So the podcast gives me that opportunity. So it genuinely comes from a place of, I'm building it for myself. Whoever listens on top is a bonus, right? Without any conscious attempt at building audiences. But what I also realized was, back to Clay Christensen, 1 hour conversations are one size fits nobody. Because, when you listen to a leader, if I listen to Jeff Bezos, I might be curious about a certain element of Jeff Bezos' leadership and not his whole journey. So I said, is there a way I can sort of miniaturize the content and make it easy for people to access? So I realized, back to your question about building audiences, I realized that for a minute, if we go through a biography of a leader, right? Childhood, early choices, leadership, boards, and so on. I realized that if I sliced it by theme, if I did a playlist of, let's say, early childhood, maybe that playlist is relevant for young parents or so on. Or the playlist on boards might be relevant for people on boards. So I realized that if I slice the conversations horizontally by theme, then maybe each of those themes appeal to a different target segment. So at least that's sort of the genesis for creating the nuggets. The one thing I try and do painstakingly is to break down a conversation into about 10, 12 slices and organize those slices by themes. It could be themes such as reinventing yourself or navigational principles or work and life or women leadership and so on. And those themes often have sharp target groups because of the nature of the topic they address. To answer your question about the reach, I mean, till date, it's reached about 750,000 listeners across the 50 plus speakers. So 50 plus speakers, 500 plus pieces of content, about 750,000 listens. So I'm not really, as I said, the podcast is not, I don't see it as a money-making business, but genuinely it's a learning opportunity for me. And I try and leverage some of the learnings from the podcast in the context of the consulting work I do and share nuggets with my coaches or my clients, which are sort of fit for purpose. So it gives me the ability to share contextual content. There's a lot of content out there, but I feel that contextual content is often stickier than just content.
Wonderful, fantastic. That's I want to pick back up on the theme thing. It's an incredibly smart thing to have done and very inspiring. I'm wondering about, how did you choose the themes and what themes turn out to be the most popular, if it's possible to define that?
I must say it was organic. I must also talk a little bit about the direction of the podcast that it's taken over the last, let's say, 50 plus, right? In a way, I started out with where I had reach. So I started out with leaders in India and their journeys. So in a way, the initial conversations are quite biographical, right? What was your childhood
Right.
like? How did you end up excelling in this field? Talk about the transitions and so on. So see, for me, the fine line, Claire, is to not make it too cut and dry, to
Mm-hmm.
say, here are 10 questions, let's get started,
Yeah.
and not make it too open-ended, right? In which case it becomes hard to curate by
Yeah.
themes. So I need to sort of walk the tightrope when I have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But your question, I would say it's evolved organically over time. Initially, some of the initial nuggets were more around, parenting, early influences, key choices, what does success look like,
Mm-hmm.
transitions, and so on. But over time, I've been able to find my access to the thought leadership ecosystem, right? People like
Mm-hmm.
Hermione Ibarra at London
Sure.
Business School, Michael Watkins at IMD, and so on.
Mm.
I feel they now trust the platform and trust the quality of the content.
Yeah.
So there, it ends up being a lot more subject specific. For example, I spoke to a lady called Tasha Urich. The whole podcast was about self-awareness and insight, right?
Right.
So, and to your question about what's more popular, it's a tough one actually. I think reinventing yourself is a popular one because a lot of people I
Yeah.
think are grappling with it as you would endorse, given
Mm-hmm.
given the work you do.
Absolutely.
Navigational principles is something similar. Settling into a new context is something that people appreciate because every time a leader joins into a new role, I've curated experiences from various leaders, including, let's say, Mahatma Gandhi, when he moved from South Africa to India to lead the freedom movement.
Indeed.
I spoke to his biographer on how he spent the first year. And that wisdom is often useful for a new CEO who's settling into a new company. So I think my objective is just like we talk about diversity of thought at the board. I feel if I can sort of have some sort of diversity of thought on a certain topic, whether it's resilience or whether it's settling in, and sort of get diverse views, then I think people might find it thought provoking. So I think some of these themes I feel people find valuable. They've had more traction than the rest.
Fascinating. I'm loving the idea of being a new CEO or a new leader and aspiring to do it as well as Mr. Gandhi did. That's
High bar.
super interesting. Yes. I'd love to come back to the question of reading and curious minds. You've made some very interesting references to some of your subjects and contacts with regard to this. But what do you find that you most enjoy researching and reading to stay on top of your game beyond the insight that you get from those you create podcasts with?
No, I think I'm trying to go deeper in this realm of transitions, Claire. As we speak, for example, I'm curious about Bob Keegan's work about adult development. I'm sort of trying to understand transitions from different angles, right? One is about uh, a big piece is how we develop as human beings, and I find his work quite interesting. So I'm trying to build a little more of a granular view of how we develop the 5 stages of development, and let's say specifically this when we move from being the socialized mind to the self-authoring mind, how does that transition happen, and how does that impact the choices we make or the angst we feel. So as we speak, that's the theme I'm curious about. And also, given we have finite time, to the extent possible, I'm trying to see if I could read in a way that's synergistic with the podcast that I create, so that I'm not sort of diffusing my time. So to the extent possible, I'm trying to see if I could read around the areas where I'm likely to get people to give me time for the podcast. So to that extent, I'm a little what do I say? I'm a little watchful about diffusing my time. But maybe the one thing I want to come back to is to broaden my reading. Actually, strangely enough, I've realized that while I'm reading, going deeper in some of the issues that I want to be curious about, somewhere in the last maybe 12, 24, 36 months, I haven't kept the breadth of my reading. So one of the things that I want to do more of is read a wider range of topics and sort of get inspiration from different spaces.
Yes, I absolutely concur on that desire to stay broad in terms of reading. And one of the things that I've really embraced in the last little while is advice that comes from all kinds of people, but Tim Ferriss springs to mind as that of making sure that you're reading fiction and history and stuff that isn't directly linked to the leadership space. The inspiration that comes from seeing how a character in a novel tackles a particular problem can be just as powerful, if not greater, sometimes than some intellectual musings on the subject. So I find that the inspiration that I get from other types of reading than that which might be described as essential for this leadership and career and transition space is incredibly useful, and one that I used not to make time for.
Couldn't agree more. If I may throw in movies as well, right? For example,
absolutely.
Movies like Martian, Sully, Good Will Hunting. Some of these movies, I find deeply inspiring. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you just said.
Absolutely. And curiously enough, I mean, we're sort of delving down into slightly more popular media, but I find even that well-constructed TV series, whether it's some Netflix massive production or whatever, are so interesting in terms of character development and transition. They're all about transition. The goodies turn into the baddies and vice versa. And watching that and observing it is absolutely fascinating in terms of situating the work that we do.
So true. Completely agree.
So we can justify that evening spent on the couch watching Netflix.
It's work time.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. So Deepak, coming back to this theme of your having started your work in this coaching space with it, and the podcasting space with Indian clients, Indian leaders, Indian subjects, and then radiating your way out. Tell us a little bit about the contrasts you see in the work that you do with Indian clients or Indian leaders and those from other different cultures and environments.
I guess at some level, it is contextual, Claire. I think a lot of 70% of the work ends up being with Indian clients. And sometimes, as you would appreciate, it's a relationships business. So you go wherever the relationships take you.
Absolutely.
One of the initial clients was a French CEO who was running a large cements business in India. He was part of an Italian conglomerate, which was taken over by a German conglomerate. And he reached out to me more for his journey, saying, what should I do next? So it was more personal counsel, personal transition, if you will.
Yep.
And I did that. And one of the things I do is post Egon's that I've built relationships with the rest of the executive search community. So I sort of act like a sports agent or a sell-side banker, if you will, and introduce the leader to that ecosystem. So had a good relationship, good association with him. And 2 years later, long story short, he moved to an Asian country as a CEO, as a turnaround. And he called me saying, can you help me? Can you be my sounding board, and can you coach some of the members of my team, and can you do something to raise the level of the team? So it was sort of a bespoke solution, which had to be crafted, which was fit for purpose. But back to your theme about so in that case, there was a very clear case of it was an Irish headquartered company which had a subsidiary in this Asian country, and there were a few Europeans, few Asians, and there was a cultural nuance in terms of just the dynamic in the room, and a little bit of, if I may use the term, a little bit of that colonial overhang, if you will.
I can imagine.
So I think it was just so there the HR head is an Asian, but the CEO is a European. So you want to ensure that the style you adopt puts both, adds value to both clusters. At the same time, it ensures that it sort of takes into account that dynamic. So that's just one example. I was working with another Spanish individual, an MD of director of a large investment bank, Swiss bank in India. So there it was Indian geography, Swiss headquarters, Spanish national. So it's sort of a triangular complexity in terms of culture.
Indeed.
So I guess at some level, as you would appreciate, this varies from context to context. But how does the approach change? Is there any systematic difference in the way I would approach it? Possibly no, but I think It's just being tuned. It's staying attuned to some of the cultural nuances and some of the norms and social behavior. I think it's just ensuring that if you're working with an Indian client, then you sort of pick up a lot of the cues by default. But if you're working with a client from a different culture, just sort of maybe looking for it in a little more of a deliberate way is probably the only thing that comes to mind.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you. And developing that a bit further, you work with leaders as they settle into their new context, whether they're Indian or from some other place completely. This is what we call in our particular framework, the 4Es, the engage stage of things. And I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of those who found particularly effective methods for settling into a new role. And by contrast, any disaster stories that you can share.
I think if there's one theme that comes out, Claire, people that do it well, if I had to really, again, this could be very contextual, but the one thing that effective leaders do well is listen. I think a lot of leaders who've achieved success in their previous role often come in and start speaking their opinions on what needs to be done, but don't listen enough about the environment to absorb what's going on before they figure out what's the theory of change, so that
Indeed.
they can pull the right levers moving forward. So I find that's one thing that really effective leaders do when they transition in. Number one, for example, back to Gandhiji, one of the things that the biographer Dr. Guha said is for the first 1 year, he did not orchestrate any mass movements. He just traveled around the country and just took stock of the situation before he took charge. So I think there's this piece around how well you listen, I feel, is significantly underappreciated. And the other piece I notice is a lot of people quickly come up to speed on the what of the new job and the new company and the new role, but often significantly under-index on the how things get done, how decisions are made, how people communicate, how people are rewarded, and so on. So I find a lot of people sometimes quickly think they've come up to speed, and what they don't realize, I find, is that people sometimes misunderstand silence. Sometimes silence means that there are conversations on water cooler happening and some sort of feedback loops, but the word may not be coming to you, but people are forming opinions about you. So there's a sort of this, people mistake silence to be as a false sign of acceptance, and that often is a hurdle that they don't anticipate. So I'm working with a large tech company. So especially people who come into sort of not revenue roles, but let's say staff roles, they find it challenging. For example, one of the leaders who's come in needs to handle revenue. So I think there's a significant challenge because there's a lot of interlinkages with other functions. So you need to build relationship. You have fewer levers of control. You need to influence. So I find those people challenging. I think the other scenario where to your question on the disaster point is sometimes people I was working with a clean tech entrepreneur who hired a CEO, and I was working through that transition, and it was a two-way conversation, right? You had to ask the entrepreneur to back off while ensuring that the CEO was flourishing. But what people don't realize is very quickly it gets into a vicious cycle. If the CEO, the entrepreneur, has built the business with sweat and blood, and if he feels that the CEO is not moving enough, then he jumps in. And then then the CEO feels that he's not given enough space, and then it sort of sets off a vicious cycle. So I think there, in this particular instance, the CEO possibly didn't see the signs enough or listen to the feedback enough, and it quickly set off a vicious cycle. So yeah, these two examples come to mind, but I guess each situation is contextual.
Let's switch to the work you do in the foundation that you're involved in and any other volunteering. It's very heartening to see and learn that you have this involvement, but please tell us more about how it fits in and what you do, and if appropriate, how we the listeners can help.
Thank you for asking. So this is a not-for-profit called Antarang Foundation, ANTARANG Space Foundation. Maybe stepping back, when I was moving on from Egon Zehnder, I said maybe I need to do something in the context of giving back. So I got associated with this group of people called Social Venture Partners. They're a global organization, which is a group of philanthropists who put aside a small, let's say, sum of money, and they sort of collect a pot of money and they deploy it in these organizations. And the key point is their whole thesis is that people want to give back, but they often don't know how. So why don't we create a platform which encourages philanthropy and makes it easy for people to do it? So it sort of creates, imagine McKinsey team kind of situations, team rooms, team formations, if you will, rather than trying to do it alone. So I was assigned to this not-for-profit called Antarang Foundation as a social venture partner, along with a couple of people. And as I spent with them, and the crux of what they do is they work with students from challenging backgrounds in India. And as you would appreciate, India is a country of contrasts. So there are thousands of young adults who have let's say suboptimal education. B, even if they're educated, often the link with employment is broken, right? They don't get the access. So Antarang strives to bridge that gap. And I started working with the founder. And at some stage, when I was looking for somebody for my podcast to edit my podcast, I realized that this skill is not available in the market because it's not an established profession for me to hire for. So I said, why don't I bet on potential and hire somebody who has got the hunger to learn and maybe can edit my podcast. So actually, my first employee was a podcast editor who came from one of these communities in Mumbai. He's an alumnus of Antarang Foundation. So that's my second link. And then I hired one more guy who helps me with the website and social media and so on. But the reason it appeals to me is, in a way, the underlying theme is how do you enable these kids to play to their potential, right? It just felt at some level, I felt there was a resonance with the central theme around which I wanted to organize my life. And I'm sort of influenced by the work of Adam Grant, a professor at Wharton.
Yeah.
And in the book Give and Take, he says that he talks about chunking rather than sprinkling. He says give, but try and organize your giving around a few chunky things rather than desperately giving away your time or money or resources to a bunch of different things. So somehow, as I was thinking about how do I chunk up different things I do, I felt it sort of fell squarely in the theme of play to potential. So I spent time with their leadership team, Priya Agrawal, the founder, and the team. I use the podcast as a fundraising platform, and I mentor these two individuals who are my employees as editors and as social media professionals, and I hope they can play to their potential. So that's sort of my association with them. So to your question about how listeners can contribute, if there is a section on my website, playtopotential.com, called Pay It Forward, which has details of at least the headline details of the foundation and how people can make a difference.
Fantastic. Well, we will endeavor to create some sort of link to that in whatever blurbs we create around this. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sure there will be plenty of people inspired to take some sort of action, either with you and through you, or indeed to take the model and apply it to themselves. And I very much like the idea of chunking, not sprinkling, in this particular context. It makes a great deal of sense. Now, one of the last things I'd love to ask you in this limited time is about how easy you find it to apply your own advice to yourself and your own career. What do you still find difficult to do with regard to your own progress and development?
It's a good question. One of the questions I grapple with is, inside out or outside in. And what I mean by that is, a part of me says, I need to be selfish about how I spend my time with family, for myself in terms of exercise and music, play the guitar or whatever, and work and so on. And whatever impact I can do, I do. The other school of thought is outside in. Here's a big problem to be solved. A part of me sees thousands of professionals dealing with midlife through career transition and so on. So the size of the problem is big. So part of me wonders, is there a more systems kind of an approach, or should I build an institution to solve the problem? And to your point, sometimes in terms of dissonance or resonance with what I tell people, sometimes I tell people, you might have you thought about, setting up a goal that you aspire to? So here's a case where I must say, at some level, I've been quite selfish in terms of how I frame my life. I've tried to be inside out rather than outside in, which is being driven by the problem. So that's a piece that I grapple with. I don't have a clean answer to it, but that's something that I think about. Should I build an institution? Should I think about systems, or a different way of going after this problem? I think the other piece I would say is mindfulness and deep work. One of the things that I'm still, it comes up in some of my conversations with people, is to sort of put away digital distraction and sort of do deep work. I try and do that, but I think that's a space where I feel there's a lot of improvement possible for me to put away distraction and sort of really go deep in a certain topic. That's the second theme that comes to mind. And the third is, I think, at some level, I also want to ensure that, I tell people, the faster you run, the aperture of your opening of your eyes narrows in terms of what else you can see or the possibilities that you can consider. So I just want to ensure, as I build momentum in this transition, where to go, how to grow, am I missing out on other adjacencies where there could be possibilities for me to learn and make a difference? So I guess that's the question of how narrow should I be, how broad should I be?
Yes,
but,
slowing down to speed up. Yeah.
So I don't think I've answered your question cleanly, but these are some of the questions I grapple with as I go through my
beautifully. I'm curious to understand, again, this could be useful tactics for our listeners. You say you struggle with doing that deep work and going fully into mindfulness and so on. And I'm wondering, when you do get at least part of the way on that particular axis, what sort of techniques do you use? Are there any tips you can give us as to how you achieve it, even if you're not achieving it perfectly yet?
True. The one thing I've learned, Claire, is fighting willpower is hard. I read somewhere that companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google are pumping millions of dollars and even hiring people from places like Las Vegas who are specialists in how do they get your attention. So that battle is hard to win. So I realized the only way to make it happen is to really structurally solve it. So for example, the day I want to spend editing a podcast, let's say, without interruption, I keep my mobile phone at home, and I just come to office without my phone when I don't have any calls or whatever. So I think what has worked for me is to shut off the tap. I find it difficult to keep the tap on and not drink the water. So the method that works for me is to shut the tap and then dive into deep work.
Fantastic. That's a simple tip, though obviously not always easy to implement. But one final question I have for you is, what do we not yet know about you through this conversation that you would like us to know?
No, I like as a passion project. One of the themes back to work and life. I'm inspired by the thinking of Stuart Friedman of Wharton, and he talks about 4 domains: self, work, home, and community.
Yes.
And he talks about having osmosis across these 4 domains rather than treating them as watertight containers. Try and do things which tick multiple boxes at the same time. So at some stage, I've been learning the guitar for a few years, not a professional by any means, but enough to amuse myself. Earlier, I used to sort of focus on it as a separate pursuit, carve time away from home with family, practicing in a room and so on. But then I said, why do I need to do it this way? Why don't I sort of do something that's fun and with family? So one of the things I've been doing for a while actually is recording songs with my kids. Hopefully so we've, right from the age my daughter was 3, she's now 10. So we've recorded some 20, 30 songs where she sings, I play. And hopefully these are memories that we'll cherish 20, 30 years later. But that's a passion project of mine.
Beautiful. Absolutely wonderful. Well, on that lovely note, I think we should probably wrap it up here. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, Deepak, for having shared so openly and so freely a multitude of aspects of your work and life and beliefs. It's been incredibly edifying for me, and I've truly enjoyed it. So thank you on behalf of Antoine and for all our listeners. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, Claire. Uh, a lot of questions that you asked actually provoked my thinking, and clearly lots for me to reflect on. But genuinely, thank you for reaching out to me and for getting me on your platform and your series. I'm genuinely humbled by the fact that you thought I could add value to your journey.
Thank you so much.